This up.
Great. Okay, I'm going to start the webinar now. Have a great event. Good evening, and welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Katie from Greenlight, and we're thrilled to host tonight's event with Wesley Brown presenting his recently reissued book, Tragic Magic. He will be talking with Reginald Dwayne Betts, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Wesley, Reginald, and the team at McSweeney's for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. Though we're not able to host events in our store spaces, our community of authors and readers is still here. We're grateful for your support and for this chance to make space for conversation and connection. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping things to go over tonight. In our Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here though, and you can see a count of fellow attendees at the top of your Zoom screen, but the exact location will depend on what kind of device you're using. There are a couple of different ways that you can interact with the author and with each other throughout tonight's event, which we highly encourage. The first is the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon. You're welcome to post your comments and thoughts in the chat. It's a great way to show your appreciation for the author and to interact with fellow attendees. So if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post that in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We'll be pulling questions only from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program, so please make sure you're putting your questions there and not in the chat. And importantly, tonight's featured book, Tragic Magic, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person in our bookstore locations, 12 p.m. to 7 p.m. every day of the week. And you can purchase Wesley's book and many others on site. Or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I've dropped the buy link in the chat and I'll drop it again throughout the event. If you care about supporting the careers of authors and the ongoing existence of independent bookstores, buying tonight's featured book is a great way to show your support. Our interviewer tonight is Reginald Dwayne Betts. He is the award-winning author of 4 collections of poetry, a nonfiction memoir, and a powerful body of essays and scholarship that has been featured in such publications as the New York Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post. The founder and director of the Million Book Project, his work has earned him a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, NEA Fellowships, and a PEN New England Award for Poetry, among many other recognitions. His most recent collection of poems, Felon, was a winner of the American Book Award and the NAACP Image Award, and a finalist for the LA Times Book Award. He is also the author of the memoir, A Question of Freedom, a memoir of learning, survival, and coming of age in prison, and the poetry collections Shahid Reads His Own Poem and Bastards of the Reagan Era. He will be speaking with our featured author, Wesley Brown. Wesley is the author of 3 published novels, a collection of short stories, Dance of the Infidels, and 4 produced plays, including Dark Meat on a Funny Mind. He is Professor Emeritus in English at Rutgers University and has taught literature, drama, and creative writing at Bard College at Simon's Rock. He wrote the narration for a segment of the 1997 PBS documentary W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography in 4 voices, and is co-editor of the Methuen Anthology of American Women Playwrights, 1970 to 2020. His book, Tragic Magic, is the story of Melvin Ellington, a.k.a. Mouth, a Black 20-something ex-college radical who has just been released from a 5-year prison stretch after being a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War. Originally published in 1978 and edited by Toni Morrison during her time at Random House, this of the Diaspora edition of Tragic Magic features a new introduction by the author. Wesley is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then he'll be talking with Reginald and with all of you. Please take it away, Wesley.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really great to be here, having a conversation with Reginald, whose work I really greatly admire. I'm going to read just the opening section, just a brief portion of the intro. It's called A Few Words Before the Get-Go. As an intern in the read section of sound, I've been bucking to win the critics poll as a talent deserving wider recognition. I know all the standards and am particularly adept at playing the immortal "to get along, you go along." But there are times when, in spite of myself, I undermine the popular rendition by not playing it as it was written. and flirt with the tragic magic in if, maybe, suppose, and perhaps. When this happens, I flash on my namesake, Duke Ellington, and recall what one of his mentors, Dad Cook, once told him. Learn, learn the rules, then forget them and do it your own way. More than once, this advice has subverted my best intentions to go along with the program. So at auditions to enter the fold, I get the urge to play against the melody, behind and ahead of the beat, to bend, diminish, and flatten notes, and slip in and out of any exact notation of what and how I should play. Ella Fitzgerald has been one of the foremost practitioners of the form of talking shit known as scatting. With the air as her scratch pad, she has scribbled much syllabic salad into song. Once during a concert in Berlin, Ella forgot the words to Mac the Knife, but bull skated her way through it with some bodacious makeshift palaver. After the performance, she was declared the official voice of the land of Oobla traveling airmail special and postmarked from now on. Once during a show at the Apollo, the headliner tried to chump the audience off by playing bad imitations of the imitators of his own work. But a woman in the balcony wasn't going for it and let him know about it. All right, now, let's have some interpretation. This type of ensemble playing rises from the streets of my life like a herd of elephants running off at the mouth. A space opens up where I can take my solo. I open up considering a fish and chips joint across the street. Now, some folks hold to the notion that fish were made for the dish and let the chips fall where they may. But just maybe as a side order argument, fish were made to swim free and let the chips fall where they can best get a play. There I go again, more rowdy blank verse. Like the rest before me, I seem doomed to dissonance and thoughts like high water pants that are too far from where they're supposed to be. So I'll leave it there. So that's the opening section. A few words before the get go to the novel Tragic Magic.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Mr. Brown.
Same here, Reginald.
I was born in 1980 and messed around and woke up one day a couple years ago and had more gray hairs in my beard than I did before. And it hit me that I used to I used to like read literature and feel so um not detached from the words, but not connected to the writers. And what I'm and I didn't understand what it meant to become a writer. I didn't understand how any of that happened. And what I find myself now just like astonished by is being able to be in conversation um, with people like you. I mean, James Baldwin blurbed this book, and and I think it's important for a few reasons. And I'll lay out just I'll get it out of the way and lay out why I think it's important. Right now in this contemporary moment, everybody understands mass incarceration as an American problem. And a lot of people read the new Jim Crow, and you hear it in the news, and you hear it. You have organizations that 20 years ago didn't think about prison as an issue. And I think what that has done is help shape and define our understanding of prison. But I think what's really important about this reissue is that it allows us to think about these systems of incarceration before anybody else cared about it. And so I think this is one powerful thing that your book does. But it's also like really funny in some real ways. I was um I was listening to Cornel West and he was talking about how one of the things the Russians are able to do is talk real about life without feeling like they're performing for anybody. And part of not performing is to be able to recognize the absurdity in like everyday life sometimes. And I think this book captures that too. So I guess my opening question is to ask you, what does it feel like to have a book um, be reprinted, be republished after all these years and still had the same resonance? Because I mean, it's literally, it's passages, it's scenes that I could see happening right now from the freedom highs to the kid who gets beat down by the police to get the other kid free, um, to a lot of the stuff that happens in prison. So I just wonder, what does it mean to find that the work that you wrote years ago actually still is not just still resonating, but could have been written last week, could have been written last week, in many ways.
Well, it's gratifying to find, that the book has the second life after over 40 years. And in some ways, in looking at it, it's as though I'm reading a book, a novel that was written by someone else. And
Mm.
that's probably one of the pleasures of revisiting Tragic Magic, is that I'm now looking at it from the point of view of a reader, not so much as from the point of view of a writer. Because 40 some odd years later, it's not that I'm a different person, but I'm not the person uh, in all aspects that wrote this book. So it's a different experience from what I had in 1978 after the book was published. And in reading portions of the book, I have this experience of saying, well, this sounds like a book that I'd like to read.
Yeah.
And I think if having that approach to something that I've written so many years ago, it seems that it's come full circle. And I'm also curious about how another generation of readers approaches this novel. And many things that I've read or heard in discussions with writers such as yourself, Reginald, uh, gives me a different perspective of the book that is quite illuminating. Things I learned about what different perspectives uh, writers, readers have, and their take often instructs me about the book in ways that I had not even considered at the time that it was published. So I'm very gratified that the book has this second life. Most books have a difficult time having a first life.
You telling me? I got a couple books that refuse to get off the ground. In fact, I be shook sometimes. I don't even be wanting some editors to know I'm doing stuff like this because they like, why you not writing? Where's your copy at? Let me ask you this. How'd you hook up with Toni Morrison? I do believe that so my mom's birthday, her name's Gloria. Her birthday is the same day as Toni Morrison's birthday. And it's one of those things where um you recognize that some people on the earth touch you in immeasurable ways, and and so like my mom touches me in like ways that I can't really imagine. I mean, she's always been my foundation, my root. And because she shares a birthday with Toni Morrison, and that was one of the folks that made me be like, I could struggle through a book and get some meaning out of it. Like, you ever read a book and didn't understand anything, and then finished it and read it again and was
Mhm.
like, oh, like I read Paradise
Uh-huh.
and swear. And the reason why I didn't understand anything in Paradise is because I couldn't grapple with what the men had did in the book. So
Uh-huh.
I kept rearranging their race and their circumstances in my own head because I thought men who had come through what they come through wouldn't have done what they did.
Mhm.
And it was only on reading it the second time that I could grapple with it. But anyway, I wondered, like, how'd you meet Toni Morrison? I mean, what does this look like in 1978 when you got somebody who will become a literary giant, ushering others in, like having that kind of generosity?
Well, I was in um, graduate program in creative writing at City College, which is in Harlem. And there was a workshop I was in with the writer Susan Sontag, and she passed the book, part of the manuscript, on to an editor, Ted Solotaro. At that time, he was an editor at Bantam Books, which is a paperback house.
Yeah, yeah.
So that the way it would work out is that the paperback house would sell the book to a hardcover publisher, and then the paperback house would then publish it in paperback. But that never happened, given a lot of things that happened to do with the editor leaving. But that's how, fortunately, when the manuscript was sent to Toni Morrison, whom I imagine would have stacks of manuscripts on her desk, that it was my good fortune that she pulled my manuscript out of what must have been a pile. And she got in touch quite quickly and said that she was interested in publishing the novel. So,
I mean, that's what's up. Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of story you could tell people. Like, listen, you think you good, man? I got pulled out of the stacks by Toni Morrison. What are you talking about? I mean, it's funny though, because I was thinking about this. I mean, I guess you got Muhammad Ali, and so I guess now what I'm wondering is, what is the world like in 1978 when you even conceive of this, right? Because again, people get mad at me, but I don't know how much Americans actually care about incarceration.
mhm,
And it's so ever present in our rhetoric now that the gritty level, the like, the what it means to not be able to go home, the what it means to, you said something here. I was like, how do you know this? She was like, yeah, I mean, I've been bidding off you too. I was like, wait a minute. They said this in the 70s, and so it hit me. It's like, I really do wonder, I guess two questions. One, how did you come to that aspect of the narrative? And then two, so even the idea of writing about prison, where did that come from?
mhm,
And then how did you learn what you learned about the penitentiary that comes out in this book?
mhm. Well, initially, I was writing this novel while I was incarcerated at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary, and that was in 1972. And but at that point, there was no connection or no part of the book that was set in prison, because I at that point at that time I think I was too close to the experience to really be able to confront it in a way that would have been, I guess, clear to myself, or at least to struggle with what I was doing. So it was only after I was paroled that a friend of mine, at that point, it was just a novel about the 1950s and what it was like for uh, males, particularly in my generation, dealt with masculinity and all of the
Yeah.
ways in which growing up, uh, men, males, we are implicated in these very rigid um, ways of constructing how it is to be a man. And so, this character of Melvin doesn't seem to be able to fit into that mold. And he tries very difficult. He tries very hard, but he can't seem to do it because of temperament and just for other reasons. So basically, it was a story about coming of age as a male in an environment which is very driven by these sort of this toxic masculinity that forces uh, young males such as myself to have to choose to either take a certain path and find out that that's really not who you are, but sometimes to be forced into it because of the tribal connection. You don't want to be set off to the side, which is, of course, what happens in prison as well. So a friend of mine, when I was released, had said to me, "Well, Wesley, if this book is about manhood, about a character coming to terms with what it means to be a man and how he is ambivalent about what his place is, then you're going to have to deal with your incarceration." And I was somewhat reluctant, primarily because I was fearful of getting close to that experience. But what I realized is that my not being or my not wanting to move closer to it meant that I had to write the book or include that, because if I was afraid to confront or was fearful to confront what I had experienced and incorporate that into the novel, then that was precisely what I had to do, which is something which was reaffirmed for me when I met Toni Morrison, and she, always said that the thing about pain, both historical and personal, is that not that it's something that you should pull away from or avoid, but to move closer to it in order to have at least the possibility of coming to terms or reckoning with what you've
Mhm.
gone through. So I think that that's how the incarceration part of the novel was then became the focus of the book. So
That-
sometimes you don't know, you think you know what you're writing about, and then you find out uh, that that's not really what you're writing about at all.
It's a couple things in there that I think is worth teasing out. One, quiet as kept, man. Some of us think people ain't go to prison in the 70s.
Mm.
I think that even myself, when you talk about, even when you like talk briefly about the experience, and how it came up in your work, and how you got to be willing to run towards that pain. I find it like a lesson for me, and all of my writing is infused with prison. I don't think it's because I want to run towards the pain as much as like being incapable of like just getting away from it. But one of the things I wondered though is because you didn't, and I wondered this about you as a writer, but also wondered this about you as the person who experienced some adjacent kind of experiences. I went to prison because I put a pistol to somebody's face and carjacked them, and I was 16 and did 8.5 years. But you went to prison like Muhammad Ali, and so one of the things I kept wondering about early in the book is a scene where the guys is like, they like, yo, but we know you ain't really supposed to be here. And that's a certain level of respect. Like you ain't like us. But
Mm.
I wonder how I kept wondering, how does Melvin feel when he hears that note?
Mm.
How does he feel about how he is positioned in relationship to the guys around him when he was like in, so like, I'm not fighting your war in Vietnam.
Mm.
And sometimes they were in for, for what I was in for. And
Mm.
I wonder how, I wonder how you thought about that. Because I think it's interesting because the book does a really compelling job of raising that question
Mm.
without trying to give us an answer. You like, yeah, I'm forced to just keep thinking about it, keep wondering, how does Melvin feel and how do I feel if I'm Melvin, since I become Melvin in the reading of the book.
Mm. Well, I think for Melvin, it's, I guess you consider that the other, the men who are incarcerated, who are there in many instances for trying to do harm,
Yeah.
uh, and in some ways they feel that he must be, that he could have gotten out of it since he had the opportunities to go to college, and so his path was different. And I would agree with you. There's a certain amount of respect they have for what he has done, but in other ways, it's probably some shame that, oh, you could have gotten out of it, so you must be, uh, if you didn't want to do it, if you didn't want to go into prison because of your opposition to the war, then why did you follow the assumptions of the state who was sending you there? That if you didn't want to go, then why did you submit to going to prison? And so
That was
and
so funny to me because I was like, so was you just supposed to say no? I mean, like, and and that's just how dudes in prison be talking. Like, well, you refuse to go to war. Why you ain't refuse to go to prison?
yeah, yeah. So it's a kind of ambivalence that he has about being perceived both as someone who did something or who came to a realization that he didn't want to do something for principle, but then in some ways being condemned or taken to task for principle in a world where it's hard to do anything on the basis of principle without paying for it, very severely. So they have a kind of double-edged sword approach to him, and also the notion that, well, you're not someone who comes to prison, so while you may have respect, but you're vulnerable because you're not like us. So in order to, I guess, for a lot of the inmates in the novel to really have some sense of power, and is that they have to try to intimidate him to see if that principle that he has, how strong that is. And
Yeah.
so that push on him to see, well, if you got courage or you think that you have done something for the sake of principle, let's push you to see if you are really believe in what you say and what you've done, and try to see if they can find some weakness.
You know, interestingly enough, I feel like that comes up a lot in the book, and it's not just in prison. It tends to come up. Well, two things I found it really compelling here, that a lot of things, contemporary moments. I think you capture it. It's you Melvin gets out of prison and he's walking through his neighborhood. He says, "A kid almost knocked me over coming through the gate of my old school. I
Mhm,
looked at the high iron gate surrounding the building and the grated wire covering the windows. These security measures reminded me of the day I approached another building that had U.S. Penitentiary chiseled in the brick. You know, I feel like, a lot of this is, I get mad at people. I shouldn't even say this because, we might as well be in Brooklyn right now and they're going to tell, Brooklyn is going to challenge you when you say things, right? But I get mad at people sometimes because they tell me that we have to read, and they have a litany of books about incarceration that we have to read. And I've always felt like I got my political education through fiction. And I
mhm,
read a passage like this that's written in 1978 and feel like when I'm thinking deeply about what you just said, what you wrote in these words in a book published 2 years before I was born, this is the school to prison pipeline.
mhm,
And I think it's several moments like that where you find you questioning the way society exists. And so I guess I want to read one more passage, and then I just want to ask you this question of
mhm,
where did it come from? So I thought this part was hilarious. I think it's hard to be funny in a novel. So I think you got this balance of being
mhm,
like insightful and you're flagging mass incarceration, but also that whole piece that you just talked about was that sort of ambivalence between who belongs in prison that
mhm,
people in prison grapple with, in the
mhm,
ways that us on the outside don't really characterize or recognize as much. But in this piece, it's like to be a part of the movement, they got to read 100 Years of Lynching, and white folks got to read it. They got to read it without stopping. And black folks, and this is a funny thing about it. The black folks can read it, but they can stop whatever they want. I know Paul Beatty's read this book. You know what I mean? Like I read this and I'm like, man, I read Paul Beatty in this book, right?
mhm,
And so it says the black folks can read it and but they can read it, but they're not supposed to stop. But they ain't gotta have a witness. And
mhm,
so the white guy has the question Melvin about it, and Melvin's like, "Why is this white dude talking to me about this book?" Which is an absurdity in itself, right? Like you gotta talk to me about how I relate to Black history, and then
mhm,
he's like, "Did you read the whole book?" He's like, "Nah, I ain't read it. I couldn't get through it," and I found that whole passage
mhm,
both hilarious and informative because I thought it raised this question of what does it mean to understand what it is to be Black in America.
mhm,
And the books that I've read as a student, I know my moms ain't read.
mhm,
I know my grandmom ain't read. But I have to mess around fight somebody if they try to tell me that my folks don't understand mass incarceration and they don't understand racism and they don't understand systemic racism because they haven't read the 10 books on your PhD list, right? And
mhm,
and, and so I guess what I wonder is this book seems to Melvin seems to be the character that's rejecting these litmus tests for 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 being in the know, for lack of a better phrase for it. And I just wonder what made you push back against that, because it seems like I didn't know that in the 70s those same kind of standards existed where you had these litmus tests. But I wonder what made you push back at those metrics for what it meant to be righteous, and what made you parallel it to prison, because I think it does get parallel to the same metrics of what it means to be a man in prison, get parallel to the metrics of what it means to be a part of the revolution when you're free.
mhm, mhm. Well, you mentioned about the humor in the novel. I think that is important, was important to me because there's a quote, I think, at the beginning of the novel that I quote a playwright. Says, if you want to tell people the truth, you better make them laugh. Because which is
Hmm.
what comedians do, is that most instances, people don't want to hear anything that makes them uncomfortable. And so, but you can get sort of inside their defenses by telling a story that's not, that they don't have to necessarily personalize about having a finger pointed at them, but they can see the truth in a story where the person telling the story is also implicated in the story, with the story being told, and is not trying to lecture someone. And I think for Melvin, as important and vital as the 1960s, early 70s were, there was uh, a difficulty that many people who were activists had in trying to step back away from some of the rhetoric and be able to see that you can't behave or act through theory or some kind of formulation that doesn't have to do with the way we as human beings actually behave or act, that we are a maze of contradictions. And to say that someone needs to perform or behave in a straight line, if you, I guess, you look at these medical shows, a straight line means that the patient is
It's
diseased.
dead.
So,
Yeah.
so I think for Melvin, he's trying to, both inside and outside of the prison, in terms of the political movement and also inside the prison, not to get entrapped in only one way to be not only a man, but only one way to be political, and how that narrows the possibilities of growth, of what your life means at any different points in time. So I think that's also part of his struggle. What does it mean to be a man growing up in New York in the 1950s? What is it to be a man since, the movement in many instances in the 60s was very male driven. Women were often shuttled off to the side and then, weren't seen as significant because it was about Black manhood. And
Oh,
also
it
in
was, yeah, it
prison.
was that piece. Yeah, it's that piece that you got in there where homeboy wants the young woman to sleep with a white dude, and she's like, I'm not trying to do that. And it's like, that's your fantasy. And
Mhm.
I also thought it was something to be said about how the book was pushing at that, was trying to acknowledge some of these tensions between, um, what do we mean by toxic masculinity, or what do we mean
Mhm.
by men just actually not living up to their ideals. So
Mhm.
let me ask you this though, because it's interesting. Like, you were in prison, and again, you were in prison for standing on your ideals, which I think is quite. It's like I frequently feel like a deep sense of um ambivalence towards the way people talk about my incarceration. It's like, I want to say, look, I robbed somebody. Let's just be real. People say you shouldn't have been in prison. You're only 16. I'm like, well, I robbed somebody, so let's just it is what it is, and maybe I talk about it obsessively, but it is what it is. But for you, I think you went to prison for standing on your principles in a way that, I mean, Muhammad Ali is lionized for it. And so I wonder, how do you feel about that now, all these years later? And then the second question though is, I wonder, how did you feel in the 80s? Because I feel like in the 80s you had a unique perspective of American society, in that you saw prison before incarceration rates went through the roof. And I think you had a different understanding of it that's reflected in this book. But then you saw the war on drugs, and you saw the violence, and you saw the prison rates escalate. So I just wonder, those two things, how do you feel now, reflecting on what it meant for you to go to prison for standing on your principles, and going through the 80s? I wonder just how you thought about prison as an
Mhm.
institution in American society.
Mhm. Well, the first part of the question, how did I feel at the time, coming out of the civil rights movement, both in the South and in the North and in the West Coast, those movements with the Black Panthers, is that I think being young, youthful, uh, had perhaps everything to do with my um, not only my sense of principle, but also not thinking about the consequences. Because when you're 20, 21, 22, there's a sense of invulnerability, or that you're going to follow what it is that you believe, but not necessarily think about what the consequences may be, which I think is something that we begin to think about once we get older or more mature. And I guess so I think immaturity probably had a great deal to do with my determination to stand by what I believe, regardless of the consequences.
I'm gonna
So,
start telling people. They're gonna be like, "Well, why'd you go to prison?" I'll be like, I was immature. I mean, if it was a war, I would have just chose not to go to the war. But it wasn't a war, so I robbed somebody.
well, I think immaturity, not in a negative sense,
Yeah, no, I
but
know.
I think that youth is often a period of time where we have very final or ideas that we don't question, that are they're intractable. And so during the 60s, it seems that we knew a lot about what was wrong with the world and what we wanted to change, but we really didn't know much about ourselves as persons, as individuals. And I guess the good news about that is that if we had looked within ourselves to see all the confusion and ambivalence, we probably wouldn't have been able to do the things that we were able to do, because we were thinking about, well, what if we do this? What are going to be the consequences? What if I do this? That might make this happen. And that kind of equivocation is something that, as a young person, I didn't really want to deal with, because for me it was either this or that.
But this is why I asked the other question though, honestly, because like, I have no story about going to prison
Mm,
that reflects me standing on some principle, besides not snitching on somebody. But that ain't even, that ain't even it. It's nothing that makes me say I went to prison based on a principle. And that's why I wonder
mm,
how you reflect on like the current conversations around mass incarceration, but
mm,
how you reflected on you. I mean, Harlem in the 80s was it wasn't like, it was like violence, it was crime, it was drugs.
mm,
And you saw it as somebody who was like, dude, you want me to protest for you on these streets? I went to prison for not going to the Vietnam War. You went to
mm,
prison for selling heroin. Like it feels like, and I don't know if that's how you felt, but I just wonder, it will help me understand how to reconcile the two,
mm,
hearing how you reconcile the two.
mm. Well, I think one of the things that I uh, was in a situation where I had parents who were working class, who were come from the South, migrated to the North, uh, wanted my sister and myself to get an education. That was the focus, and to sort of keep us out of harm's way with very rigid rules and regulations, which I think were invaluable to me. They kept me from, I think, um, pushing myself to do something, because it would gain me favor among my peers, because I guess I was more afraid of my parents
Yeah.
than whatever else was going on outside of where we lived. So I think that was part of it. And that um, I also understood when I was in college that it was doing, that everyone was supposed to, all males were supposed to uh, have a draft card. And if you were, for a few years, that your draft status was dependent on your grades. So if you weren't doing well, you could be called. And what I did, another friend of mine did in college, we went to the registrar's office and told them that we did not want our grades to be sent to the draft board, because it was discriminated against, young blacks in particular, who didn't have that opportunity and were at risk to be drafted, whereas I had a deferment. And so I felt that that was not equitable. And so, of course, I got, my parents thought I was out of my mind. You have an opportunity, and then you're going to sort of give up that opportunity for some principle. And there it is again, And I think not, feeling that, well, I don't care about consequences. I'm going to do what I think is right. And at the time that I went to Lewisburg, there were about 250,000 people total that were incarcerated. Now I guess I'm at 2.5 million. I mean, it is just incredible how the incarceration numbers went up in the between the 1970s and between then and about 1994, of course, when the crime bill was
Yeah.
passed. So I guess I had a sense that I guess I thought I had an understanding of what my position was in relation to other Black men who didn't have didn't have the opportunity to choose the path that I was able to choose, and so it gave me, I guess, a perspective about um, uh, why I guess my own view about the choices that I made because I had choices, and how that was far different from a lot of Black men, young Black men who didn't have those choices. Most of the guys that I grew up with went to Vietnam. Some came back. Those who came back were damaged, um, and so again, for many of them, they some of them dropped out of high school, went directly into the service. Others just found a path where they felt they were hemmed in and didn't find that there was a way out of, what was entrapping them on the streets. And
It's
I guess
kind of true.
you know,
It's kind of true. I wonder how many, because we don't have a Vietnam. I mean, my generation didn't have a water fight,
mhm,
and so we went to prison. I wonder if it was a water fight, how many of us would have went to war instead of went to prison? It's like an interesting question because it didn't feel like, strangely, it didn't feel like. I mean, the same way the soldier sometimes commits all kinds of crimes against humanity.
yeah,
Sometimes you do the same thing in the street,
yeah,
and sometimes, I mean, I guess it's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. The very just idea that having a war leads so many people to go to war, and
mm,
not having one ended up leading so many people to go to prison. And I know it's not a one-to-one relationship between the two,
mm,
but it's something unsettling to think about um, who I might have been during Vietnam as
mm.
opposed to who I was during the 1990s. I got a happy question. Like like so I one of the beautiful things though, listening to you talk, I mean you mentioned Susan Sontag,
Mm,
you mentioned Toni Morrison, we talked about Sonia Sanchez earlier.
mm,
How has it felt like to be a part of American Letters, to truly be a part of the whole epic scope of what this country has produced? I mean, your work travels in jazz. I think I would be really surprised if Paul Beatty wasn't familiar with your work. It has this kind of um, biting
mm,
social commentary that uses humor to get it across, that's present. You wanted to, you know, I mean, my work exists because you, Claude Brown, and these folks are writing about experiences in prison and creating art out of it. So I wonder what it feels like to be just like a part of the formation of a significant part of
mm.
like American Letters.
Well, I think that again, I feel I was fortunate to be in a situation where uh, there were there was this avenue to where I was trying to figure out if there was any way that I could fulfill this idea about wanting to write. And somebody told me they heard on the radio about this workshop at County Cullen Library. And since they knew I was writing, maybe I should check it out. And so I did. And then I find myself in a position where I meet Sonia Sanchez, who is very, inspired me. And from there, getting, first poems published to meeting someone like John Killens, being involved in his workshop. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with luck. But I think about luck is that you have to be ready to be lucky. And
Yeah,
that and so if I wasn't made some choices to go to that workshop or to say, well, I'm not getting involved in that, those choices determine what opportunities or what luck I was able to have in meeting certain people, finding a community of other young writers. And so I think that choice has a lot to do with it. put me in a position where I would meet writers, other writers like Ishmael Reed, like Sonia, like Louise Merriweather, Toni K. Bambara, June Jordan, Audre
This is
Lorde.
like, yeah, this is a generation of icons. This is like I grew up writing in y'all. It's interesting too, because now trying to study, what happens is you end up studying their work, and it's really interesting to think that these were like people. I'm gonna ask some. So some people in here that's checking it out. I want to know if y'all got any questions. Drop them in the Q&A section. Now we open it up for questions. But the first time I met the first time I met Sonia Sanchez, I was in DC. I knew a bunch of folks, and she was giving this reading. I just got out of prison, and this is before GPS was ubiquitous, right? And
Mm,
so I live in PG County, Maryland. It's right near DC, but I ain't really know DC. And I literally just got my driver's license, right?
mm,
And they say, Sonia Sanchez is at the train station. Can somebody pick her up? I say, I'll do it. I got it. I got it. Man, I pick her up. I get lost in 2 minutes. I can't even figure out how to leave a train station, right? And I'm like, nah, I got it. I'm just a little flustered. I just got out of prison. And I could imagine her listening to this story like, why did they send him? I have no idea how to get there. I don't know how to use my cell phone. I'm trying to use my cell phone while I drive. It's not working. It took me like 20 minutes to get there, and I got her there. And she was really gracious about the whole thing. But I say all of that to say that it's interesting to think about what it means to like have folks be a part of that whole tradition of American letters and then get to know them a little bit as people. And I still wonder, who these folks were that were able to come up with this stuff. So I'm fortunate to get to talk to you because um it's easy to read the book and don't check the bio out and don't recognize the history that went into gathering this hard for understanding that is chronicled in the book. So again, we got time for questions from folks, and if folks don't have questions, I have more questions. One of these questions is, what led you to get into teaching?
I guess again, I stumbled into it. I was, I had, I guess after I got into this master's program, well, even before that, I just wanted to write. And I didn't want to, I was driving a cab on the weekends and living, sharing an apartment with a friend of mine in Harlem. And that's basically all I wanted to do. And then this uh, fellow writer um, says to me, well, you know that there's this master's program and that you might want to check it out. So I wasn't that keen on it, but I did. And again, I made a choice and I was accepted. And I was studied with this writer, Donald Barthelme. He was one of the, these foremost short story writers, experimental writers in the last 40 years or more. And initially I knew he had a name, but so I decided, in my ignorance. I said, well, I don't want to be in a workshop with someone who has a reputation because there's too much jockeying for permission, position. So I want to be in a workshop with someone I don't know. But they said, well, you have to be in his workshop because he decided that you were someone that he wanted to have in the workshop. So as a result, he was he thought my work was significant. And he was the person, the writer, who steered me to my first agent. And so
Mm,
these are the things that happen, a convergence of luck, opportunity, circumstance that converge. So that's how I got into teaching as a result of being in that master's program. Uh, I applied for uh, some positions. Someone said, well, why don't there two these positions? There was a position open at Rutgers and at Harvard. So I sent out, my resume to both. Obviously, I didn't get accepted to Harvard, but in their writing program. But Rutgers in New Brunswick got in touch with me, and I got an interview. So again, sometimes I wasn't really moving towards something, made a choice to do something, but I was in the vicinity. And so circumstances sort of converged where I was in the right place at the right time to meet someone who gave me a lead. And then I got this teaching position at Rutgers in 1977. And so that, of course, led to to teaching there for 26 years. And the reason why I got the position was because Tragic Magic had been published just recently. So it's a crapshoot in many instances. Not that everything is a matter of having talent, because there's writers that I know who were extraordinary and who by circumstances they never really were recognized, had an opportunity to experience the high regard in which readers had of them. I think of someone like George Kane, who wrote
Mm.
this novel, Blues Child Baby. It was published in the early 70s. And he had some demons, uh, drugs, and he never was able to find his way out of that to write that second novel. And the character in Blues Child Baby is very much like George Kane, who was struggling. And
How do you feel about that? Like, this is an interesting thing. And so if you were in prison this year, or 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, and would have become a writer, your
mm-hmm,
go-to would be a memoir.
mm-hmm,
And I don't even say that as a point of criticism because my go-to was a memoir, and
mm-hmm,
now I'm working on another memoir. But I do find that like it's some aspects of memoir in your novel, and you just say the same thing about Blues Child Baby. But
mm-hmm,
what's interesting is I wonder the lift to go from memoir to novelist is
mm-hmm,
so hard. So you take a cat like Mitchell Jackson, and
mm-hmm,
and this dude, I don't know if you know his work, but he did some time in prison,
mm-hmm,
and came out. He wrote The Residue Years, which was a novel. So he did what you did. He took some of his experiences, in the game, selling drugs or whatever, and he turned it into a novel, right? And it forced him to be imaginative because a lot of it wasn't him.
mm-hmm,
And then he spent the novel to the next book was nonfiction, but again, it wasn't a memoir. And then he was consistently writing these profiles, and it was just a similar trajectory to yours in a way because he took these writing courses, these feature writing courses, and he won a Pulitzer Prize this year. Actually, he won an ESME, he won a National Magazine Award, and a Pulitzer Prize for the same piece about Ahmaud Arbery and that appeared
mm-hmm,
in Runner's World.
mm-hmm,
But I guess my question though is that I wonder, do you think that you had a better chance of succeeding as a writer sans the demons that say Kane had,
mm-hmm,
because in your era, cats came out and they wrote the novel. They didn't come out and write the memoir.
mm-hmm. I think there's something to that because what I was reading for the most part during the 60s were novels. Not, I mean, I read Claude Brown's, Man Child in the Promised Land, um, Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice,
Yeah.
Perry Thomas's memoir.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, I was reading novels, Ann Petrie, Ralph Ellison, James Baldwin. And so that seemed to be where I gravitated toward. And it seemed to me, when my first efforts as a writer, that it seemed that my imagination and not to be so keen on what exactly happened to me, but to imagine characters who I was a part of, but I didn't have to worry about whether what I was writing was factual. Or because even if I thought I was writing a memoir, I would be selective. There were some things I wouldn't want to put in, or I would want to select. But in a novel, for me, it was liberating because I could go anywhere and try to find some element of truth in situations that bore some relationship to my own life, but I didn't have to worry about whether I was being accurate. I could just invent.
That's but that's how I feel about poetry. So I ain't gonna front. Like, I use poetry in the same way. I,
Mm,
I make stuff up all the time in poetry. you know, but it's interesting. I mean, I did the memoir because the novel felt daunting, and now I feel like I'm in a space where I'm gonna finish this memoir and then I'm gonna write a novel, and I'm never writing anything about my own life again. You know,
Mm,
I feel like after this one, I was just like, nah, it's everything I write, I'm making up.
mm.
But that's interesting. You know who Leslie Jameson actually, I guess they also recently republished Blues Child Baby.
Oh,
And Leslie Jameson has a fascinating book, a memoir actually, and it's called Recovery, and it's about alcoholism, and she wrote it through the stories of folks like Kane, who,
mm,
you know, part of the book is actually part of the book was like her PhD dissertation, and it
mm,
was thinking about writers in English, and it was thinking about writers who had struggled with addiction. And so it's actually interesting that even for her, you know, she used their primarily fiction to
mm,
write her way through her own memoir,
mm,
dealing with the same issues. Let me ask you this question.
mm.
I think this will finish it off. I got a question. Like, what are you working on now? And I think this is a cool question I always ask writers. What are you working on, and what are the 2 or 3 pieces of art that you go to help you work on that thing?
Uh, well, I usually don't like to talk about something I'm working on because I think it's a curse. Because you know, writing is writing. Talking about writing is not writing. But I will, since
But
I'm
this is why I ain't turned my booking yet, because people keep having me talking about it.
but since I'm pretty well along in what I'm writing, I'm not going to get diverted. So since music is always a part of just about everything I write, even when I was writing poetry and uh, writing plays and fiction. So I never veer too far away from music, particularly uh, jazz. And so I've been Miles Davis has been someone who has been a part of my life since the 50s. And
Mm,
I just can't get him out of my system. I know he's someone who's had some demons that, some instances, are unspeakable uh, in terms of his relationships with women. Uh, but I found myself wanting to again move towards writing a novel about a certain moment in his life that I was wary or ambivalent about getting close to this kind of a story. And as often happens with me, I wanted to gravitate toward it because obviously it seemed to me that that was the story I need to tell. So in 1959, in August, Miles Davis and his quintet were playing in Birdland, and you probably have heard this story that he's escorting white woman, to a cab out on the street, and so he's having a cigarette, and a cop comes up and says, "Well, move along," and Miles Davis points to the marquee, says, "I'm working," and then things get dicey, and so he ends up getting beat down by another, both of these uh, police, and then he's arrested and charged with assault and disorderly conduct. Now, this is the same year, 59, that both Lester Young and Billie Holiday died. And
mm,
so for me, I'm sort of, well, what does all this mean? Why is it that I'm somewhat obsessed about that year and that moment? And so I said, well, the only way I'm going to figure this out is that I have to try to write my way through it. So it begins, and that night where he's arrested and then released, and what happens in terms of his flashbacks, things that he's just enraged about, that here he is at a moment in his life creatively where Kind of Blue was finished in April of 59, and it's about to be was going to be released. It was released 8 days before this incident, and he's he's at the, I guess, the top of a world, and here he's reminded that it doesn't really matter where you think you are in relation to the powers that be, that you can be crushed in an instant, despite where feeling that you've been fulfilled and creatively, and your direction is clear. And so those things, I think, inform my wanting to explore this particular day in Miles Davis's life, and particularly his relationship with Frances Taylor, who was this extraordinary dancer who he became involved with and married, but this was a tumultuous relationship, and he was abusive. And
Yeah.
that's something else that I feel I have to deal with in some ways, to uh, honor her as also a creative artist whose story uh, seems to have slipped into the ether. And many people said, well, she was his muse. Well, she was her own muse. And that, I guess, bringing those both of Miles Davis and Frances Taylor together, I guess I realized that that's the story I want to tell about that day and the things that happened to them that day, and of course, in the past. So
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I'm glad you gave us that glimpse into it. And what's cool about it actually is, and it even goes to writing tragic magic, is that it takes some kind of distance to
yeah.
understand the world that you want to write about. And
Mhm.
I think for me, as a writer, that's a lesson that I think I should take seriously. And the other part about it is, like, if you're talking about it, you ain't writing, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I think I'm gonna stop telling people about this book I'm writing, and go ahead and get to writing. But look, it was a pleasure to talk to you really about Tragic Magic, but about your work, to hear some of these stories about your new work. Part of it is truly because I realized that that experience from prison to writer, that continuum. I like to think that I'm trying to live along that continuum with you, and with some other folks that we know. And so I think that's deeply meaningful for me. But more than that, I think you are a reminder that the words matter more than the time you served in prison.
Yeah,
If you make them matter,
yeah.
and I think you made them matter. So, man, thank you for giving me the chance to chop it up with
Yeah.
you.
No,
Get the book.
this has been wonderful, Reginald. I'm this has been a just an honor to be able to have this conversation with you, and hopefully, we'll be able to, I guess, to have a face to face at some point in the not too distant future.
Yeah, man, I got the vaccine. I'm about to
Yeah.
get it again for real. I just want to be super careful. I'm about to get me 2 more shots just on GP. But
Mm.
I hope everybody else is staying safe, and go get the book Tragic Magic. It's an excellent book. It is insane that you could have something that was written in 1978 feel so contemporary. Whether we talk about Black Lives Matter, whether we talk about mass incarceration, whether we talk about the relationship between men and women. It is just so on point to help us think through some of these issues that we are steadily thinking about. It is a fantastic book. Everybody should go get it now.
Well, there's a poem, I forget it. This poet said, "Poetry is the news that stays news," and I think that's what anything creative and imaginative has staying power, regardless
Yeah,
of when it's done.
cool. I don't. Okay, and Greenlight
Hi.
has come back to tell people they could go eat their dinner.
Wesley and Reginald, I want to thank you both so much. That was such a great discussion. And I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Don't forget to buy your copy of Tragic Magic. As Reginald said, it's a great book. You can find the link in the chat. And you can get it in store or online at greenlightbookstore.com. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great night.
You
Thank
too.
you, guys.
Bye.